Thank you very much, James. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Dublin for those from outside Dublin, and I suppose particularly to the home of the GAA, which is the Gaelic Athletic Association, not the Global. Okay, I'm on a pretty tight schedule this morning, so I want to talk about a few top-level issues. One is the global economic context, what's happening the world economy at the moment. I want to talk about some of the risks and challenges facing the global economy. I want to talk about some key international demographic trends. I then want to hone in on some issues around the global food industry, and I want to talk a little bit about what we see here in Ireland in the food industry. And finally, I just want to wrap up on my experiences as a board member of the Aquaculture Licenses Appeal Board in this country, some of the issues we come up against in a very practical level. So I have a lot to get through, and I'm under very, very tight time instructions. So I would always tell my kids that the economy is everything, that everything that happens out there in your world, in your education, in your employment later, it's all driven by what's happening in the global economy. And I feel no differently about this topic. You know, what happens to the world economy has a massive impact on the business environment in which you operate and the issues that affect you as an industry. And as you know, and we've all lived through it, the last 10 years has been an absolutely extraordinary period in terms of global economic history. And when the next chapter is being written in global economic history, the period we've lived through since the subprime crisis commenced back in the summer of 2007 will certainly feature up there alongside what happened in the 1930s in terms of the magnitude of the economic and financial challenge facing policymakers. So it's been a truly incredible decade, there's no doubt about that. And, you know, lest one is accused of exaggerating the point, up until December 2015, we had zero interest rates in the United States. They're now up at 1.25% and rising. We have zero interest rates in the euro area. We have rates of 0.25% in the United Kingdom. We have lived through very unconventional policy making in terms of quantitative easing. Basically, the central banks in the United States, Japan, the United Kingdom, and now in the euro area are engaged in massive programs of quantitative easing, which is basically printing money. We have bond yields at the lowest level on record. I could go on, but that sort of policy environment has never been seen before, and it has reflected the nature of the shock that hit the global economy after 2007. And policymakers have struggled to, get things back on track. And for most businesses, it created an incredibly difficult period. And if I had 2 hours, I would talk to you about the particular experience here in Ireland, where we suffered one of the greatest economic shocks of any developed economy over the last decade. But I won't do that. But the good news is that economic cycles are called cycles because they cycle. And we are now starting to see the global economic cycle recovering quite strongly. You know, the US economy is doing reasonably well, hence US interest rates are rising. The Eurozone economy, after years of underperformance in the last 12 months, has shown very compelling signs of economic recovery. The Chinese economy, notwithstanding a lot of financial imbalances still in that economy, it is stabilizing, it is coming back. The UK economy, I suppose from an Irish perspective and from the perspective of the Irish food industry and the aquaculture industry here, what's happening in the UK is of incredible importance because we basically export about 40% of our food exports to the United Kingdom. So incredibly dependent on that market. And Brexit obviously poses enormous challenges for the Irish economy generally, but also for the agri-food and the aquaculture sector in particular. And the problem, of course, is that the only manifestation we've seen of Brexit to date has been a sharp fall in the value of sterling over the last 18 months or so. But I suppose the bigger issue for Ireland will be how the whole Brexit process unfolds. What sort of trading arrangements will we have with the UK after March 2019, when the UK will formally leave the European Union? So a major challenge for Ireland. But, you know, having said that, we are now talking about a global economy that is in the best place for the past decade. So things looking reasonably good. I wouldn't get carried away. You know, there's still a lot of legacy issues from the Great Recession that policymakers are still trying to work through, not least the health of the global banking system. But it's getting better. I don't want to bombard you with economic graphs and economic statistics this morning, but probably going to do it anyway. But there's a couple of things I just want to focus on. You know, I made the point that we lived through an incredible decade. And this graph, I think, demonstrates it very, very clearly. It's the quarterly profile of GDP growth in the US economy. And you can see there, sorry, I'm going the wrong direction. Yeah. You can see there, that was the dot-com recession in the early 2000s when the dot-com bubble burst. Created a little bit of a recession, but at the time we thought it was significant. But that's what you call a real recession. That's a decent one. You can see there in 2008, 2009, the manner in which the US economy literally fell off a cliff. And as the world's largest economy, that obviously had a massive impact on the rest of the world. The good news, as you can see out there on the right-hand side, you know, is that growth is coming back at a reasonable pace. And as a consequence of that, you know, the United States is now returning interest rates to more normal levels. If you move on to the UK, exactly the same story. That's what you call a decent recession. But you can also see the UK economy came back quite strongly. This is the Eurozone. Same story, gets a bit boring at this stage, but that again is what you call a decent recession. You know, literally 2008, 2009, the global economy fell off a cliff. And the business implications of that for most businesses in the world, unless you're in the insolvency business, was incredibly damaging and incredibly difficult. The good news from a European perspective is that you can see out there on the right-hand side, growth is coming back quite strongly. So it's getting better. It's a pretty constructive global economic backdrop at this juncture. This is the latest forecast in the International Monetary Fund, and you're mad if you believe economic forecasts anyway, but the view of the world is that over the next few years, we will continue to see a gradual return towards normality. Before I get on to the risks and challenges at a global level, I want to say a little bit about exchange rates, because for countries that trade with each other, the exchange rate situation is of incredible significance, obviously. And the story really from 2008 to probably the end of 2015 really was a story of consistent dollar strengthening against the ailing euro. Okay, the euro, because of the Eurozone crisis, Greece, Cyprus, indeed Ireland, etc., lots of problems. The euro suffered significantly as a result. But you can see out there on the right-hand side that the trend over the last 12 months, particularly the last 9 months, has been very much one of there's been a total reversal. The markets love the euro at this juncture. Well, maybe I shouldn't use the word love, but they're quite positively disposed towards the euro at the moment. And the dollar, sentiment towards the dollar has definitely deteriorated. So we're looking at a trend of euro strengthening against the dollar, which has obviously significant implications for the trading relationship between the European Union and the United States. But I think of much more significance for us here in Ireland particularly is what's happening on the sterling-euro exchange rate. As I said, we export roughly 40% of our agri-food exports to the UK market. So it is the single most important market. And what we've seen over the last, well, since the end of 2015, but obviously has been exacerbated by the Brexit vote on June 23rd last year, sterling is weakening significantly against the euro. That poses all sorts of challenges for the Irish food industry. It obviously makes our exports a lot less competitive, but it also results in a significant upsurge in the imports of food from the UK, because we also import a lot of food from that country. And it also leads to a phenomenon of cross-border shopping. You know, when we get these sorts of exchange rate movements, it does drive people in the south of Ireland north to do their shopping. And in the run-up to Christmas last year, I have no doubt in the run-up to Christmas this year, we will see that trend re-emerging. And for food retailers, particularly down here, that is a massive, massive challenge. And the further north you go in the Republic of Ireland, the bigger the challenge becomes. So, but I suppose the issue here is that sterling is very much a currency out of favour at the moment, largely because of the absolutely bizarre political backdrop in the UK at the moment, the manner in which the whole Brexit issue is being addressed. And I think if anybody was watching the Conservative Party conference in the UK yesterday and the problems that Theresa May experienced, I'll probably start coughing myself now as I say that, but I think it just symbolised in a very sad way the chaos in the UK political system at the moment. And in that context, you know, the markets don't like sterling, but I suppose from an Irish perspective, it just exacerbates the whole uncertainty about how the Brexit process may unfold over the next couple of years. I have said that the global economic backdrop is very definitely becoming more constructive, but I suppose it's the job of economists to dampen spirits. You know, what could go wrong? What are the issues and challenges out there? I suppose most of my life over the last couple of years has been dominated by politics rather than economics. During 2016, we saw the Brexit referendum on June 23rd. We saw, and if I insult any of your political allegiances, the US part of the audience, I apologize, but the election of Trump last November, you know, was an interesting event. I teach economics on a master's program in University College Dublin, and on the morning after the election of Donald Trump, a young guy from New York was coming into my class, and I just stopped him and said, "Well, how are you feeling this morning?" He started crying. Yeah, I cry a lot about Irish politics, so I can empathise. But I think what Brexit proved and what Donald Trump proved is that it's the rejection of conventional politics. It was basically electorates, and this is a legacy of the crash and the pain imposed by the crash. But I think Brexit and the Trump victory were very definitely electorates giving two fingers. Are you aware of the term two fingers? Sorry, I won't get into it. But it's basically electorates giving two fingers to the conventional political system. Okay, and obviously political events like that have potentially serious economic repercussions. Coming into 2017, we in the economics world certainly were very worried about the European political diary for 2017. We had a Dutch election in March, we had the French presidential election in late April, early May, and we had the German election the weekend before last. And during 2015 and 2016, the far-right anti-EU parties were performing very strongly. And the fear was that what happened with Brexit and Trump, that rejection of conventional politics would carry over into the European elections and create serious problems for the stability of the European Union. In the event, I think the sensible Dutch and French looked at Brexit, they looked at the Trump situation and decided we don't really want to go there. So those two elections turned out, you know, reasonably okay in the sense that we got moderate centre governments put in place. In the case of Germany, Merkel has reattained her fourth term as Chancellor, but I suppose the challenge for her now is the fact that the far right has gained over 13.5% of the vote, now has representation in the German parliament. So that is definitely going to complicate life for Merkel. But I suppose the point I'm really making is that European politics turning out better than we feared a couple of years ago. There's an election in Italy in May of next year, and if there are any Italians in the audience, I apologize if I'm about to insult you, but I think you would have to admit that the Italian political system, the party system, has always been characterized by chaos. And at the moment, anti-EU right-wing parties are commanding 45 to 50% in the opinion polls. So if those parties were to assume power, they probably won't, but it definitely would cause some problems in the European Union into the future. But anyway, that's politics. Other issues that are of significance: migration. We have seen the migration crisis out of North Africa over the last couple of years, creating massive tensions in Europe. I have no doubt the Brexit referendum was heavily influenced by migration. If you look at across the EU 28, which it still is, we've had very different responses to that migration crisis. The Germans have had a very open door policy at one extreme, which backfired to some extent on Merkel. And at the other extreme, you have countries like Poland and Hungary that have very strong anti-immigration parties in power, and the rest of us are somewhere in between. So the ability or inability of Europe to deal with the migration crisis is causing lots of tensions, and I will return to that in a second. Global terrorism, obviously a massive issue. Terrorist attacks, but you look at the North Korean situation, Trump and the growth of protectionism. One of the things I thought Trump's economic agenda, a lot of it was sensible. You know, cutting taxes, investing in infrastructure makes a lot of sense. The one area of economics I would disagree fundamentally is in the context of free trade and protectionism. I think free trade has made a massive contribution to the development of the world economy over the last 30 years. And I think it would be a pity if Donald Trump started to reverse the North American Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership between the EU and the United States. So, you know, that is definitely a challenge. If we see the growth of protectionism, well, very definitely it will impact all of our abilities to trade. Brexit, obviously a massive issue, shrouded in uncertainty. Equity markets have been on a bull run since the first quarter of 2009. Despite all of the difficulties that we've experienced during that period, markets continue to go ahead. The concern is, and economists are hopeless at calling it anyway, but the concern would be that having come so far, we've gone past the average equity market cycle. So equity markets looking vulnerable to a correction at some stage. I have no idea when it's going to happen, because there is a very artificial environment out there with quantitative easing and zero interest rates. Investors have no place else to go other than into equity markets. But it's one to watch. China, despite the fact the economy is stabilized, lots of financial imbalances that could come back. And finally, the global interest rate cycle moving in an upward direction, the reversal of quantitative easing. These are the issues, I think, that will dominate the global economic and political agenda over the coming years. I want to move on to say a little bit about global demographics. These are forecasts for global population growth out to 2050 from the United Nations, okay? And you can see there that the global economy is expected to grow the global population expected to grow by over 32%. And if you look at where the growth is going to come from, 109% in Africa, 19.9% in Asia, a decline in the European population, Latin American, Caribbean growing reasonably strongly, North America growing reasonably strongly, and Oceania growing by over 46%. But I suppose the key point is if you look at, number one, the global population growth, number two, the main driver, which is Africa. Lots of implications from that. Now, the point about those forecasts is that 50% of the growth in global population will come from 9 countries: India, Nigeria, Pakistan, the Congo, Ethiopia, Tanzania, the States, Indonesia, Uganda, in that order. Okay, so you can see the population growth there. And the final 4 there, China, France, Germany, the UK, you can see just the contrasting population growth projections there, with German population expected to decline, China expected to decline, even though I suspect with the ending of the one-child policy, that forecast is going to change. But you're still talking about an aging, declining population. But I think the key point here is that 50% of global growth emerging from 9 countries. Most of those countries are on the African subcontinent. So that has massive implications for everything really, but particularly the nature of food consumption, food production, which I'll now talk about very briefly. Some of the issues in the food sector, as I see it, at a global level, the key issues are climate change, which is having a massive impact on food production. Retail concentration is a significant problem where fewer and fewer massive multinational retailers are dominating the whole retail food environment. Big issue here in this country also. Energy dependency, food production is a very energy intensive activity. So that's in the context of climate change and climate targets and so on. That's a massive issue. And the other big driver is obviously the global population growth that I've just spoken about. Here in Ireland, as an indicator of what's happening, we live in an environment where consumers want cheap food by and large. We have significant retail concentration where a number of small retailers are dominating the market. There is a view out there that food production is a license to print money, but the reality for food producers, and it applies to the whole aquaculture industry as well, is that it is a very competitive business. It's a low margin business. It's a business that is open to significant domestic and external competition. So it's a challenging, anybody in the food production business, it's a challenging environment. And one of the dilemmas I think we face as food producers, but also generally, one of the dilemmas is between price. Consumers want cheap food. And a cheap food policy is dangerous because the BSE crisis in the United Kingdom back in the late 80s, 90s, that was driven primarily by a cheap food policy. Because if you pursue a cheap food policy to the ultimate, it will definitely undermine the quality of food production and the quality of food we're eating, and by implication, safety. So lots of issues there in the food sector. At a global level, the population projections out to 2050, it is estimated that those projections, if delivered, will translate into a 60% increase in agricultural or food consumption. Okay, so food and food production, it's a growth industry heavily driven by those demographic trends. So feeding the world, nurturing the planet are the key challenges there. And we hear, I was watching some of the videos that were running here earlier this morning about food sustainability and so on. Sustainability is now the big theme in food production and also in aquaculture production. Weather is disrupting production, and as we get more and more severe weather events, it is going to distort food production more and more around the world. And I think increasingly food security will become a much, much bigger issue. So the future of food, the demographics are generally very positive, as I've shown you. A lot of people coming into the world. One of the things I didn't mention there was that by 2050, India will surpass China as the most populated country in the world. Okay, so the demographics, more people, more food required. But I think one of the issues there is that because of where the growth in population is going to come from, I think at a global level, we are going to see a continued massive increase in income inequality. And even within developed economies, we are seeing that trend towards increasing inequality. And at a global level, I think with that sort of demographic change, that income inequality is going to become a much bigger issue. So what the implication of that is that there's going to be a huge segment of the global population that will struggle to pay for food. You know, that's the reality. And there's another segment that will focus on quality. So it's an industry split down the middle, driven by very different aspirations and drivers. We are seeing very strong investment around the world in food production. Here in Europe, and particularly here in Ireland, when the EU quotas on milk production were removed a couple of years ago, we have seen massive investment, in dairy production. So a lot of investment in production to feed the world. But I think one of the challenges for food producers is that as those barriers to trade are broken down, you know, as those quotas are lifted on production, etc., that we are likely to see a lot more price volatility. And indeed, in the dairy sector over the last couple of years, we've seen quite a bit of price volatility. But generally, it's a sector with a good future, but an environment of limited price and power and volatile prices, efficiency in production is the key to success. This is a trend of consumer prices here in Ireland, and the orange line is food inflation. And you can see since January 2005, consumer food prices have declined. And the yellow line there is fish, seafood. You can see the price compression there has been even more difficult. So in the Irish sphere, we're talking about an industry where there's serious price compression, and that obviously intensifies the requirement to have efficiency in production. So it's a challenging environment, and that ain't going to change. Finally, just to wrap up on I'm getting a lot of dirty looks down there. I started 5 minutes late, okay? Apologize. But the key issues we see in aquaculture here in this country, you know, climate change is having a significant impact on production. As we get more and more severe weather events, it is causing a lot of problems for aquaculture production. And tying into that, the environmental issues around aquaculture development, a massive issue with pollution potential, etc. The health benefits of seafood, definitely a massive theme, but there is also a theme that farmed food is not perceived to have the same sort of health benefits as wild seafood. So I think there is a challenge there for the industry to convince consumers about the safety of farmed seafood particularly. The impact on tourism we find when aquaculture operators apply for licenses to create a fish farm, there is always a very negative backlash from the tourism sector, because tourism is a major industry in this country, a lot of investment in it, but a lot of people believe that fish farms and so on damage natural beauty. So that's an ongoing challenge. And NIMBYism, I think, is the biggest issue of the lot we face. And NIMBYism is not in my backyard. There's always massive local opposition to every aquaculture development that is proposed. And that's what we see in the Aquaculture Licenses Appeal Board. A lot of objections coming in, and that seriously complicates the whole licensing process and pushes it out. I could go on and on, I won't, but those are the key issues we face. So listen, I hope I've given you a flavour for the whole global economic environment, global demographics, feeding down into food and aquaculture. And who is this girl? You will see there's a video, Origin Green, run by Bord Bia. I don't know, have you seen it yet? But there's a guy in a beard standing in a field who happens to be my brother, and that is one of his animals who will end up in a McDonald's burger. So thank you very much for your attention. Enjoy the rest of your stay here.